Hello, and welcome to American Heron Wargaming. This is a very special battle report for Warhammer the Old World. Not long after establishing a playable force of dwarves, I saw a post on a Discord from a friendly local game store asking if anyone was interested in playing a huge 5,000 points per side siege game of the Old World. This is the sort of thing that mass battle games are legendary for, so I didn't want to miss out. I hopped on the team for the Forces of Fantasy and started off on a grand adventure. The narrative for the scenario was that the Elector Count of Averland, Horus Cuthbert, had called on us to help defend his home. He had no standing army, but is a good man and an important trade partner for the forces of good in the area. Orcs had been raiding his lands and were pushing close to his capital, and had been joined by a force of rabble peasantry who were taking the opportunity to revolt against their master. Our primary objective was to hold the keep. Whichever side had more forces inside the castle by the end of turn 7 would be the ultimate victor. However, we had two additional objectives. There were 3 small farmsteads in the area outlying the castle. If we reached them, we could rescue the peasants there, to help keep the local economy strong. Furthermore, our final objective was Count Cuthbert himself. Despite his lack of a standing army, he was determined to help his people. He would be controlled by the GM, and was gallantly protecting them from the field, but would listen to reason if a good faith effort was put forward. We were to try to protect him as much as possible. In addition, during setup, each player was given a secret mission to accomplish during the battle. Even though the list composition rules were fairly relaxed, I ended up going with a fairly familiar list to my usual 2,000 point force. Since I didn't have too many reps under my belt, I figured that I should stick with what I already knew. I was using the Expeditionary Force Army of Infamy, and my general was an engineer with a handgun and the Master Rune of Slaying. I figured that there might be some big monsters coming our way, and that would be a cheapish way of keeping them honest. Then I had 2 engineer sappers, one with the runes of Rapid Fire and Concussive Force, i.e. the Stupidity Gun, and another one with the runes of Rapid Fire and Accuracy, plus a Rune of Passage. There was a single runesmith with a Rune of Luck and 2 runes of Spellbreaking. One Battle Standard Bearer Thane, carrying a banner with both the runes of Stromny Redbeard and the Rune of Battle for 2 extra combat res, plus runes of Stone, Preservation, Might, and Fury. He was fully tooled up just for being on foot. The final character was another Thane with the runes of Fortitude, the Master Rune of Swiftness, and Might. Then I had 2 beer carts, 2 blocks of 20 warriors with full command, drilled and veteran, 9 rangers, 3 thunderers, 3 scout gyrocopters, 4 cannons with no runes at all, and 5 miners with blasting charges and a prospector with a steam drill. My partner was a High Elves player, and despite that, they were a pleasant teammate. Their forces were led by a prince on a star dragon, and supported by a noble battle standard bearer with the Sword of Hoeth, the Banner of Resilience, the Seed of Rebirth, the Talisman of Protection, and the Warden of Safari. An Archmage provided magical support on a steed with a Charmed Shield, Silvery Wand, Seed of Rebirth, and the Blood of Calador. Their magical specialty was Elementalism. They also had 22 Lorthern Sea Guard with a Razor Standard, 19 Sword Masters of Hoeth, 2 units of 6 Dragon Princes, 6 Sisters of Avalon, and a Merworm. Against us, the peasantry was represented by an Exile Bretonnian and Empire list. The Bretonnian list started with a Damsel on a Unicorn and a Ruby Ring. The Valorous Battle Standard Bearer was carried by a Paladin with the Exile Vow with a Gromrail Helm, Charm Shield, and the Virtue of Empathy. An Outcast Wizard on a Warhorse and Earthing Rod shored up the magical department. And keeping the rabble in line was a Sergeant-at-Arms with a Charm Shield, Obsidian Stone, and additional hand weapon. They had 2 blocks of 36 and 39 yeomen, 10 peasant bowmen, and 10 Border Princes brigands. In the Empire side, they were led by a Grand Master of Moor, a Priest of Ulrich, and 2 engineers. There were 9 Inner Circle of Moor, 19 Two-Division Guard, 2 Great Cannons, and a Trebuchet. The Orcs and Goblins were led by a Black Orc Warboss on a Wyvern with a Talisman of Protection and Trollhide Trousers. There were lots of casters. A Goblin Oddnob on a Giant Wolf with the Staff of Badoom, and 2 Orc Weird Boys, plus a Night Goblin Oddgit. Then 2 more Orc Big Bosses joined in, the Battle Standard Bearer with a Big Red Raggedy Flag and Trollhide Trousers, and another on a War Boar with Trollhide Trousers as well. There were 21 Black Orcs, mobs of 20 and 19 Orcs with shields in full command, 10 Boar Boys, and 30 Night Goblins with Netters and 3 Fanatics, plus 3 Revertolls, and a Giant. Just getting set up was quite the feat. Most of our forces started off inside the castle walls or on the battlements, but the Elven Cavalry started outside on the flank to prevent a traffic jam as we sallied out from the portcullis. We'd already agreed that we would not sit behind the walls and wait, mainly because of the Count and the peasantry that he was attempting to protect, but also because it would be more fun that way. The forces of evil sat up on the other side of the road leading to a wizard's tower, ready to swallow up the hamlets. The brave Count stood defiantly, and somewhat foolhardily, staring down at the horde fast approaching. The forces of evil were also given siege tools. Ladders were carried along by the infantry blocks for easier access, and a siege tower was pushed along by one of the orc mobs. With the forces arrayed, it was finally time to start the battle. There was no roll-off for the first turn. The invaders were coming for the castle, and we were going to watch them push for it. A wall of models advanced on the castle. I tried to set up a camera to record the entire battle as a time-lapse. That failed because the battery ran out about halfway through that movement phase. When it was all said and done, though, the weight of the task ahead was felt even more palpably. And then, a twist. The odd knob had been set up inside the wizard's tower, but we didn't really know why. In the movement phase, he was able to cast a special spell from the tower which spawned a unit of bloodletter demons inside the castle walls. The gyrocopter corps, which thought it was safely waiting for an opportunity to strike, was charged from behind. One was able to fire and flee, but the bloodletters managed the longer charge into one of the other two. It managed to survive, but fled, and they overran into the next one. The shooting phase was also devastating, as the Empire's great cannons took two of our dwarven cannons out of commission before they even got a chance to fire. On our turn, we mostly kept to the plan of sallying out. One unit of dwarf warriors and the sword masters made their advance, while the warrior block containing our battle standard bearer and runesmith turned to face the demonic incursion. The remaining cannons tried to put damage into the siege tower, as they were outranged by the great cannons, and that tower would need a lot of work to get brought down. Of course, one of the two failed to wound, even rolling a 1. It was not an auspicious start. The gyrocopter in combat with the bloodletters survived and fled, but they advanced onto the battlements. Definitely not what we wanted to see in our backline. The elven general and cavalry advanced towards the first hamlet to support the count, but the enemy cavalry was also approaching the position, though the building standing in the middle promised to make any potential charges more interesting. And that's where we stood at the end of turn 1. The tide of bodies continued to descend as the ravening hordes advanced. The right flank, however, paused a bit, not wanting to go directly into the jaws of the dragon and elven cavalry. In the shooting phase, 4 thunderers were picked off of the battlements by the war machines, though we felt fortunate that the toll was only that many. The bloodletters were reinforced by the odd knob in the wizard's tower, and they turned around to accept the charge from the dwarven warriors. Our turn began, and the miners were brought in as close as possible to the great cannons. If they could put an end to that fusillade, that could keep our guns firing for longer. The swords masters received magical buffs to prepare for the onslaught, and the second dwarven formation marched out with bugmans on their breath to meet the enemy head-on. On the flank, the lead unit of dragon princes and the elven general flew outside the orcs' front arc, preparing to wreak havoc next turn. The count was pleased to be met with the elven cavalry surging past him into the enemy. We directed him to make his way inside the castle, but we'd have to see if he would heed that advice. Our cannons continued to work on the siege tower, bringing it down to only a single wound remaining. The thunderers were still out of range, but the rangers and elven archers began planking away at the enemy formations. Our opponents had done a good job, though, of protecting that giant and the wyvern from being targetable by the engineer with a handgun of slaying. Inside the castle walls, the warriors met with the bloodletters, taking out 7 of them between combat and demonic instability, and losing only a single warrior. The moment was upon us. The true combat was about to begin. Or maybe not. The enemy forces had been arrayed in marching columns, but as they approached, they spent this turn arranging themselves into combat order. The black orcs adjusted to receive the charge from the dragon, and the knights moved up just outside of engagement range of the dragon princes so that they would not get any bonuses on their charge. The boar boys shot forward, hoping to slip out of the dragon's charge arc. In their shooting phase, 4 dwarf warriors fell to bowfire, and the great cannons blasted one of the 2 remaining dwarf cannons. The combat inside the castle courtyard continued to swing in our favor. Having the BSB Thane and Runesmith helped our unit whittle down the bloodletters to only 2 left, while losing only a single warrior. Then it was our turn to unleash some fury. The miners tried to charge into the great cannon, but contacted the engineer first. The boar boys did not get far enough to avoid the dragon, who charged into their rear, and they got hit by the dragon princes in the side. In the shooting phase, the lone remaining cannon finished off the siege tower. That was one big potential problem resolved. 1 more dwarf warrior fell, but the bloodletters were finally scourged from this plane. The miners cleared off the engineer easily thanks to the prospector's steam drill, and overran into the cannon. The boar boys were hacked to pieces. Only the big boss remained to flee, and he was easily caught by the dragon princes. The dragon itself failed to restrain, and thus left its flank exposed to the black orcs. At the end of our turn, the board was looking a little bit more clear, but there were still many large bricks bearing down on us. Shooting into the goblins, trolls, and orcs had not gotten much work done yet. The shooting was still mostly at long range, so that wasn't really much of a surprise. Turn 4 was the true crashing of the tide of battle. The night goblins released their fanatics, and the trolls charged into the warriors, who'd been cursed by a plague of rust. On the other side of the field, one of the orc mobs had charged into the dragon princes, and the black orcs had caught the flank of the dragon. The odd knob spawned another group of bloodletters, this time behind the elven archers. The fanatics crashed through one scout gyrocopter and tried for another one, but landed just in front of it. The third flew through the unit of warriors, slaying 2 of them on its way. 5 more warriors paid the price to take down 1 troll, but somehow the unit held fast. Though in the backfield, the miners cleared away the crew of the great cannon. The knights routed the dragon princes, and after the dragon pushed back the black orcs, it was staring down them, the warboss on a wyvern, and also the other enemy cavalry. He seemed a bit trapped on that flank. In our movement phase, the remaining scout gyrocopters charged into the night goblins, hoping that between their impact hits and the weight of 2 whirling blade attacks that they could shut down the blob and the caster inside it. The dragon countercharged the black orcs, and the lone electric count charged 10 knights of more by himself. We were warned that he was impetuous, but didn't think he was so foolhardy. Ending the movement phase, one of the dwarf carts moved off the board edge. I completed my secret mission. Never let good ale go to waste. Apparently, there had been a barrel of good dwarven ale stored inside the castle, and while we were willing to lay down our lives in defense of that castle, the dwarves were not willing to risk orcs or human peasants getting their mitts on a barrel of bugmans. I needed to have one of my units pick up the barrel and move off the field. It seemed only fitting that a bugman's cart did the job. Predictably, the electric count lost his combat and fled, though it was somehow not run down by the knights. The elven prince was also turned away, and was saved from being caught by the other units standing in the way, preventing pursuit. One of the gyrocopters was downed, and the night goblins were beaten back, but did not flee. Thanks to elven magic this turn, though, the warriors caused the trolls to flee, and followed up into the flank of the night goblins. The giant had been felled by the combined efforts of the shooting units and the remaining cannon. At this point, the defenders' first wave had successfully snarled the charge, but were soon to be brushed away. At least the new wave of bloodletters had been cleared away already in the same turn between the elves' stand and shoot and 2 rounds of combat. At the start of turn 5, the odd knob cast his spell to summon demons and rolled double 6s. The GM cackled with delight. They'd planned for this, but hadn't expected it to happen. In that case, instead of a number of bloodletters, a great unclean one materialized inside the walls of the castle, and charged into the unsuspecting brick of dwarven warriors. Outside of the walls, a yeoman brick attempted to charge the remaining scout gyrocopter, who successfully fired and fled. The Tudijin guard made the simple charge into the side of the other brick of warriors, though. Unfortunately for the elven prince, he had not been able to rally in time before getting charged by the black orc boss on the wyvern, and was cut down in front of his troops. We did have a bit of luck in the shooting phase, as the remaining great cannon misfired. The unclean one cut down 3 dwarfs, but took 2 wounds in return. Out on the field, the dwarves lost only 1 warrior, but decided to beat a hasty retreat into the area recently freed up by the final gyrocopter's destruction. We seemed to be losing ground both out on the field and inside the castle, but it was our turn to try and reverse our fortunes. Fortunately, the warriors did rally, setting up for a glorious last stand, and gaining some magical protection from the elven caster. The shooting from the walls was fairly anemic, taking out only a few models from the oncoming hordes. The dwarven veterans were going to be sorely needed to prevent the enemy from getting through the gate, but they had their own smelly issue to deal with. Only 1 warrior fell in that melee, taking 1 wound off the great unclean one, but the bigger issue was being held in place. Unfortunately, we were running low on time for the venue we had booked, so we had to pick up the pace, which also meant that I got fewer photos of the following turns. However, we did get a lucky break. Only 1 more dwarf warrior fell, but a spike on the attack dice felled the great unclean one. The night goblins charged into the haggard dwarven formation, but they were driven back and forced to flee through their own allies. The elven swordmasters and the mirror worm took on a horde of orc boys and cut them to ribbons. In our penultimate turn, there wasn't much else for us to do. Fortunately, most of the throng was far enough away that they wouldn't be able to reach the inside of the castle within the time limit. The big boss on the wyvern was definitely still a concern, as was a fresh unit of bloodletters, although the demons wouldn't count for the purposes of scoring control of the castle at the end of the game. The miners did arrive at the trebuchet and peeled a wound off of it, suffering 1 in return. The swordsmasters finished up the orcs that they were engaged with, and the dwarven warriors clashed uneventfully against the Tudijin guard. All of the shooting only managed to score a single unsaved wound on the warboss, though. The cannon was unable to see him from its position, unfortunately. As we went into the final turn, the Tudijin guard were joined by the yeomen, but even with both units and a plague of rust, the Dawi held firm, keeping them from reaching the gates. 1 orc mob managed to reach the walls, but didn't have time to set up their climbing ladders to begin scaling them. However, the warboss and his wyvern lofted over the battlements and cut a swath through the elven defenders. But it was not enough. 1 character inside the walls, even one as potent as the black orc warboss on a wyvern, didn't outscore the defenders still on the inside. A relief force must have arrived, as they were forced to beat a hasty retreat. While the forces of good secured their primary objective in holding the castle, there was little to celebrate. The elven forces had been demolished, and the dwarves were fairly depleted as well. The Elector Count was dead, and none of the hamlets had been rescued. The only secret mission which had been achieved was the rescue of the beer keg, though that was likely to return in order to aid the garrison's recuperation. I learned that my teammate's secret mission was to conquer the wizard's tower on the other edge of the field, which explained why they were so enthusiastic about rushing down that flank. I never did learn what the goals of the other opposing players were, though. I spoke with the GM after the event, and their opinion was that, as the majority survivor force inside the castle, and with succeeding on our secret mission, the dwarves were ultimately the faction which came out of the best in the final reckoning. But it was not a major victory in any sense. But we held the castle, and we held the beer, so really, what else can you ask for? All in all, this was one of my favorite wargaming experiences of all time. I'd heard great things about co-op and siege events, and this met every expectation. The other players and the GM were wonderful to play alongside, and I thank them for their patience and their sportsmanship. I'm incredibly fortunate that I got to participate, as this was only my third game of Old World. That's all for now, but keep your axe handy.